Chapter 2 Archshade. Tika was not known for profanities. In fact, she had taken to the idea of a swear jar in Bradigan's workshop with vim and vigor. She prided herself on having a clean and proper vocabulary without any vulgarity whatsoever. As such, one can imagine that she was pretty surprised by the string of profanities running through her mind. Or rather, she would have been surprised had she not been in the middle of a profoundly paralyzing panic attack. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to go over and say hi to the whistling human, but in the same breath, her instincts would perform a complete 180 turn and scream at her to run away. The conflicting impulses in her mind ultimately canceled each other out, leaving her rooted in place. She just stood there, helplessly staring at the girl on the pier. Unable to run, unable to approach, only able to stare like a feathered little weirdo. It was all quite confusing, and Tika did not like it. The human continued to whistle, oblivious to Tika's presence or her inner turmoil. Her hands toiled away at the bundle in her lap. Tika's eyes fixated on the way the girl's fingers moved, impressed with their precision. They were covered in a thin layer of dirt and visibly roughened from use, but in spite of that, they moved with grace and accuracy. At least Tika assumed it was grace and accuracy. In truth, she had no idea what the human was even doing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the girl's whistles began to die down. She lifted her bundle of moss and sticks up in her palms, smiling proudly at her work. Tika got a good look at the creation now. 4 little legs made out of small sticks protruded from a body of moss. A head made out of a stray rock came out the front, while a dirty string came out the other end in place of a tail. It looked like a mouse. The girl had made a mouse out of mud, sticks, and moss. Tika, impressed, let out an involuntary chirp. The sharp sound may as well have been a blast of thunder for how loud it was in the otherwise silent environment. Tika's blood ran cold as the girl looked up at her, jumping in place with a high-pitched squeak of alarm.
Oh no!
Realizing that she had been spotted, Tika froze up with a similarly high-pitched squeak. It felt like a boa constrictor had found her and decided to get intimate. The girl on the pier rose to her feet to face Tika, her muscles tensed as if she were ready to bolt. The mere thought of the girl running was finally what pushed Tika's conflicting impulses to settle on a course of action. Before her brain had caught up with her, her cheeks lifted in a much too large smile.
Hello!
She greeted stiffly, her voice breaking midway through the E. She almost sounded like a honking goose. The human blinked.
Hello? Can I help you with something?
She asked.
Oh gods, her voice is beautiful.
Tika was pretty sure she was melting. It was not as unpleasant as it sounded, though. A moment later, she realized the girl had asked her something, and she had to answer.
I just heard your whistling, and it was really pretty.
She stammered out, stumbling over every other word. Inwardly, she frowned.
What is with me all of a sudden?
The human woman didn't seem bothered by the Kraven's collapsing faculties. If the small, quiet, amused, heavenly giggle she let out was any indication.
Oh, thank you very much.
Tika might have squeaked. It was hard to tell. And then it was quiet. Tika's hands fidgeted anxiously over her chest as she hunted for something to say, but no words were forthcoming. As the silence settled over them, Tika's internal panic was rapidly rising to swallow her up.
Say something, you stupid bird!
She berated herself internally. After another couple of seconds, the human smile faded away, slowly replaced with an awkward cringe.
Anyway,
she muttered, taking a step back.
I should probably be getting a move on. Have a good day, miss.
And with that, she turned to go. Now, if Tika had been panicking earlier, now she was positively breaking down. Once again, her instincts were screaming at her like a chorus of very upset ravens, but she had almost no power to parse the instructions she was receiving. All she knew is that she did not want this girl to walk away. Not yet, at least. And so she did the only thing she could think of doing when she met someone new. She introduced herself. She opened her beak, and the whistling of songbirds came forth to echo over the water. The human drew up short. She tilted her head to one side, just a little bit, to listen to the fading echo of the unusual vocalization. Then she turned back around to Tika.
Was that you?
She asked, pointing.
Uh-huh.
Tika chirped, relieved that the girl was sticking around.
That was my name. In my native language.
The girl blinked at her, clearly surprised. She tilted her head, lifting a hand to her chin.
I don't think I can pronounce that,
she said softly. Tika shook her head.
Oh, no human could. But you can just call me Tika,
she offered. The girl hummed, looking Tika up and down for a few moments. She had to fight to keep herself from fidgeting. Her face was heating up again at being so thoroughly examined, but she dared not move an inch. After a few more seconds, whatever the girl was looking for, she must have found it. She smiled.
I'm Aveline,
she said simply.
It's nice to meet you, Tika. Oh my gosh, even her name is pretty.
Tika beamed.
Nice to meet you too, Aveline,
she said before her eyes locked onto the crafted creature in Aveline's hand.
I saw you working on that. Is that a mouse?
Aveline looked down at it, then shrugged.
I guess it is. I didn't really have anything in mind when I started putting it together, though,
she said, stepping closer to Tika to let her see better. Tika leaned in to get a better look. She could start to pick out the details now, and she was astonished. For something made from what was essentially garbage, it was remarkably well put together.
Wow,
she whistled quietly, her hands lifting as if to touch it. She thought better of it a moment later and put her hands down.
That's really impressive.
Aveline averted her gaze.
That's sweet of you to say, but it's really nothing special,
she tried to dismiss.
No, really,
Tika pressed, her hands reaching out of their own accord this time. She cupped the underside of Aveline's hand in her own while pointing at the mouse emphatically.
I work with crafts all the time at my job, and this, considering the materials you're using, this is really good.
Aveline hummed, her cheeks turning a very slight shade of red. She awkwardly cleared her throat.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it,
she said, her voice a little quieter than before.
I work really hard on them. Oh, I can tell,
Tika said. She realized a second later that she was still holding Aveline's hand and quickly pulled back with an awkward squeaking sound. Aveline didn't seem bothered. She smiled softly, then put her mouse away in her pocket. She stood up a little taller and gave Tika a curious look.
So, what's a Craven from the Arch doing down here in the shade?
She asked directly. Tika let out a surprised cawing sound.
How did you know I was from the Arch?
She questioned, genuinely surprised. She squinted her eyes in mock accusation.
Are you a spy? Are you psychic?
Aveline laughed at that, a wonderfully musical noise. She shook her head.
No, silly. It's your clothes. You only see clothes that nice down here if someone happens to have some extra money to throw around. And the only people that live in Underbridge with money to throw around live on the Arch. Oh, right. That makes sense,
Tika said, looking down and pinching at her shirt with the tips of her fingers.
Huh. Honestly, I never thought these were that nice.
Aveline shook her head.
Nicer than what we get down here, at least,
she noted. Tika hummed, continuing to examine herself.
I guess.
Aveline folded her hands behind her back and leaned to one side.
You didn't answer my question, by the way.
Tika squawked, bolting upright.
Oh, right, sorry.
She apologized before quickly rattling her brain to form her answer.
You're right, I'm from the Arch. I'm an enchantress, and I was coming down here to make a delivery to a client.
Aveline's smile faltered.
You're an enchantress?
She questioned, shifting back and to the side. It was a subtle movement, but Tika saw it. She hesitated, wondering momentarily if she had said something wrong.
Yeah. Or, well, I will be an enchantress, rather. I'm still technically an apprentice. But this is my last year of training, and this was my first full project. Next summer, I'm a graduate.
The enthusiasm in her voice seemed to wash away whatever concerns Aveline had. Her smile returned, and she relaxed.
Oh. Well, congratulations,
she said. Tika, pleased, drew herself back up to her full height.
And what about you? What are you doing here? If you don't mind me asking, that is.
Aveline shook her head.
I don't mind,
she assured as she turned to look out over the water of the lake.
I like to come down to the piers when I get out of work. It's quiet down here, usually. Peaceful. It gives me a chance to unwind, think, and work on my crafts before I have to head home.
Tika followed Aveline's gaze, looking out over the lake. As she followed the slowly shifting waves, her eyes eventually wandered up toward the limited view of the sky past the roof of the arch. She spotted a bird flitting through the air, little more than a featureless silhouette against the bright blue backdrop. Seeing the bird in motion, she felt a momentary, directionless tugging in her chest. She tensed for a moment, inhaling softly, but she was quick to shake it off. She let out her breath in a quiet, whistling sigh a moment later.
It is pretty nice here, yeah.
She agreed quietly before folding her hands behind her back. She got an idea then, and gave Aveline a hopeful look.
And I don't really get to come down to Archshade all that often.
Aveline turned to her. She didn't say anything, but she was clearly listening. Tika took a breath. Her nerves were alight with anxiety, but she forced herself to plow forward regardless.
Do you think maybe you could show me around a little, please?
Aveline blinked, clearly surprised by the impromptu question. She frowned and opened her mouth to say something, but as she looked into Tika's hopeful eyes, whatever she was about to say fizzled out and died before it had even begun to take shape. Tika waited patiently, hopeful, and still absolutely panicking. Finally, Aveline smiled.
All right. That sounds like fun, actually. Follow me.
With that, Aveline beckoned to Tika and set off down the pier for one of the many roads that would take them back into the streets. Tika lingered behind her for a few seconds, a little surprised that had worked. Then she quietly squealed to herself under her breath and did an adorable little victory dance. She had absolutely no idea why she was this excited, but if she was being perfectly honest, she didn't care. She set off after Aveline at a swift jog, soon falling into stride beside the girl as they stepped back out into the streets.
So is it true that no one but the Kraven can speak your language?
Aveline asked curiously, looking at Tika sidelong as they walked. The two were moving at a measured and unhurried pace down one of the many streets of Archshade. They were on an elevated path that ascended away from the shore, with homes packed tightly together to their right and an unobstructed view of the lake off to their left. The cobbled path beneath them was smeared with ages-old dirt and muck from many years of active use and very few of active cleaning. Tika nodded.
Yep, it's true. None of the other races can replicate how we Kraven talk. You don't have the vocal cords for it. The beak's a big deal, too. There's a lot of sharp clicks and clacks and stuff, and you just can't really get away with those with human teeth.
Aveline frowned, almost looking offended.
Oh, yeah? Try me. Give me an easy sentence.
Tika paused for a second, then smirked.
You sure?
She asked.
Yes.
Aveline insisted, pausing mid-stride to focus on Tika directly.
I'm sure. Try me.
Tika rolled her eyes.
Okay, if you insist.
She said before shifting into her native language.
Hello, I have no tongue.
She had to fight the urge to laugh at the dumbfounded look Aveline gave her. The poor girl stared for several long seconds, her hands clenching into fists and rising up in a ready pose while her cheeks slowly puffed up.
Can you repeat that?
She asked a moment later. Tika did. Aveline blinked. Tika gave the smuggest grin she could muster and planted her hands on her hips.
Well, go on. Say it.
Aveline huffed and opened her mouth. She tried to say the words, but all that really came out was a series of frankly painful-sounding wheezes and a few tongue clicks. The only word she got right was no, and if Tika hadn't been listening for it, she wouldn't have been able to understand it through the accent. Tika tried to hold it in, she really did, but she couldn't, and her boisterous laughs burst out of her like the floodwaters through a broken dam. Aveline blushed and crossed her arms over her chest, looking away with a huff of annoyance.
You're screwing with me,
she decided with finality. Tika snickered.
Yep, but you still butchered the words,
she added, elbowing Aveline in the ribs. Aveline threw her arms up in the air with a groan of dismay before pressing on down the street at a brisk, stomping pace. Tika's smile faltered, and she quickly scurried to catch up.
Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't make you mad, did I?
She asked, a slight hint of anxiety creeping into her voice. Aveline shook her head.
No, it's fine,
she said, and Tika did not detect any malice in her voice. The human turned to her as they fell into stride beside one another again.
I think it's kind of neat, actually, that you and your people have something special to yourselves like that.
Tika nodded slowly.
It is a nice thing, yeah. We Kraven don't really get to see each other very often, so it's always a treat to use our own language when we get to see each other.
Aveline tilted her head.
You don't meet other Kraven very often?
She asked.
How come?
Tika looked down, her smile fading.
That's complicated.
There was a brief silence. Aveline frowned.
I've heard that the Kraven never stay in one place for long. That they're wanderers and scavengers and the like, more often than not. Is that true? Is that why you don't meet each other very often?
She asked after a moment. Tika nodded.
It is true that we tend to wander around a lot. You see, we Kraven have this, God, how do I express it in your language?
She grumbled, scratching at the back of her head as she hunted for the right words to explain one of the most intangible feelings her kind had.
It's like this, longing? Yearning? I really don't know what word would do the feeling justice, but for a lot of us, we just never really feel at home, if that makes any sense. We don't feel like we belong where we are. It gets under our skin, and it makes us feel uncomfortable and anxious. It's kind of like that feeling you get when you go to a friend's house just in time to sit in on their family having the mother of all arguments. It's super uncomfortable. And it's always with us. It's this constant nagging feeling in the back of our minds, a tugging in our chest, but there's no direction to it. It just yanks us away. And no matter what we do, we can't get rid of it. Some of us can ignore it, or maybe we just learn to live with it. It's not as bad for everyone. But for some of us, it's just too much to deal with. So they pack up their stuff and just go looking, I guess. Looking for that place where they'll feel at home.
Aveline stared at her in shock, her eyes wide.
Oh, God. That sounds horrible. Does anyone know why this happens?
Tika shrugged.
No. Mom told me it's because the Kraven used to live in the sky. She says we used to have wings, and this yearning thing is basically just really powerful homesickness. And is that the truth?
Tika shrugged again.
It might be, but it might not. Could just be some silly legend we came up with in the past to explain why we feel this way.
There was a pause.
And do you feel it? That longing?
Aveline asked quietly. Tika nodded, looking toward the sliver of visible sky again.
Sometimes, yeah. Usually when I look at the sky. It's not so bad for me, though. I can ignore it pretty easily, as long as I'm doing what I love doing. Which is enchanting.
Aveline deduced. Tika nodded again, happier this time.
Mm-hmm. I've always loved magic, and getting to carve some funny letters into totally boring, mundane objects and make them do cool magic stuff?
She let out a delighted little squeal, her fists clenching up and shaking with enthusiasm.
It's just so cool!
Aveline snickered at that.
I guess it is,
she said, though her voice was quieter than before. Tika turned and poked Aveline in the shoulder.
What about you, eh? I've been talking about me this entire time. Your turn.
Aveline laughed at that, a quiet giggle that sent a swarm of butterflies into Tika's stomach.
I guess this conversation has been a little one-sided, hasn't it?
She confessed before focusing forward.
I don't do anything special. I work at a fish farm down by the water on the northern end of town. I spend my days taking care of fish eggs, encouraging fish to breed with each other, feeding the fish, and figuring out which fish are ready to be harvested for food. Things like that.
Tika tilted her head, confused.
How do you do that without going into the lake? The fish farm was built on top of a spawning ground over the water.
Aveline explained simply.
It's pretty sheltered from the rest of the lake. A lot of fish swim in there to breed and lay their eggs. The farm takes advantage of the constant traffic and helps us keep the population high while the fishing boats do their work.
Tika nodded along quietly.
Huh. I had no idea that was a thing down here.
She mused quietly, rubbing at her beak. Aveline hummed.
There's a lot about Archshade you probably won't hear about living up on the Arch.
She pointed out. Tika did not miss the tone in Aveline's voice. She frowned.
Are things rough down here?
She asked.
I mean, I know it's a lot more expensive to live up on the Arch. It can be hard, yes.
Aveline replied.
There's a lot of challenges we have to live with down here. What sorts of challenges? Oh, the usual.
Aveline replied.
A lot of buildings and bridges are in poor repair, especially down by the water, where they're constantly exposed to the wind and waves. We get mold infestations from time to time that can cause sickness. All the best paying jobs are in the upper cities, so there's a lot of poverty down here. A lot of the older piers and bridges are falling apart, so it's not uncommon to hear about one falling out from under someone's feet.
Tika swallowed heavily, turning her attention back to the lake.
Wow. I had no idea.
She muttered, her desire to look around dimming somewhat.
It's not so bad,
Aveline said quietly.
It can be tough, yes, but I have everything I need to be content down here. I have my friends, I have my dad, I have my crafts. I don't really need anything else.
Tika managed to put on a smile at that.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Aveline's smile returned. Then she nodded down a street they were passing.
Come on, let's go this way next. And maybe you can tell me a little about what you do as an enchantress.
Tika chirped happily, keeping pace with Aveline as they turned down the street.
Oh, I would love that!
She squawked, uncaring of how loud she was. And the two continued on their way, with Tika starting to talk about her work in Bradigan's workshop. Aveline listened intently all the while, occasionally asking a question about the process, and Tika was only too happy to oblige. All in all, Tika would consider this a very successful trip. Aveline spared no expense in being her tour guide, showing her the key locations of this part of the city and making sure Tika knew how the different areas connected to one another. She pointed out the best places to stop for food, sleep, and other necessities. She showed Tika the best places to sit down and take a break if her feet got tired. And all the while, the two talked to one another. It was just idle small talk, nothing either of them would particularly remember in the days to come. But even so, Tika was having the time of her life. She didn't know why, but just something about meandering through the city and talking to Aveline felt right. But in time, the walk had to come to an end. As the hours passed, Aveline eventually started guiding the duo back toward her home, citing that her father would be getting worried about her if she took too long to get back. Tika wasn't happy that things were ending, but she had to admit that the same was true for her. Bradigan would be getting worried by this point, and she still had to go and pick up the wheelbarrow, assuming no opportunistic vultures had seen it and decided to snatch it away. Tika and Aveline came to a stop in front of a small but sturdy home with two more stacked on top of it, connected to one another by well-used rope ladders. A gentle light shone from one of the windows on the bottom house, and Tika could see a shadow moving around inside. Aveline's father, no doubt. Aveline turned to Tika.
Thank you for the walk,
she said appreciatively. She held out a hand.
I had a good time.
Tika, with a tiny squeak, shook the hand with an enormous grin.
Oh no, thank you for showing me around. And putting up with me. Really, I have no idea what came over me,
she said, genuinely meaning it. She still had no clue why any of this had happened.
Not that I'm complaining, mind you. I had a lot of fun talking with you, too.
Aveline giggled at Tika's enthusiasm.
You know, I've never met a Kraven before. I'm happy I got the chance.
Tika grinned, then released Aveline's hand to take a step back.
I'm glad I could give it to you.
There was a brief pause, the two just awkwardly standing in the middle of the street. Tika took a breath, her heart starting to beat faster again. This wasn't it, was it? She wasn't about to walk off and never see this person again, was she? She briefly looked back down the road for the passage up to the arch. Aveline frowned.
I guess you'll be having to get back to the arch, huh?
She ventured quietly. Tika nodded somberly.
Yeah. I gotta help Brad. He's got this big lecture coming up at the assemblage in a while, and I'm supposed to help with the presentation and help organize his notes and things. You know, usual assistant stuff.
Tika was quiet for a moment, then drew herself up.
Nothing will come of this if you just waddle off like a coward,
she determined, before turning back to Aveline.
You know, it's actually an open lecture. Anyone can come and see it, so, maybe, if you want, you could come to see it for yourself?
Aveline blinked in surprise at the invitation. She looked off to one side, her brow furrowing as she considered the offer.
Maybe, but that's an awfully long way for me to walk,
she pointed out.
Where's it being held again?
Tika pointed up.
At the Arcanian Assemblage campus,
she declared with an iota of pride.
Brad was even given free rein to use one of the big lecture halls. It's gonna be packed.
She was expecting a look of fascination, interest, or even just a flash of being impressed. Aveline's expression, however, was none of those things. In fact, it was impossible to read. The girl's right hand lowered to her left wrist and toyed anxiously with her bracelet. She looked further away.
We'll see,
she finally said quietly. Tika tilted her head.
Is something wrong?
Aveline shook her head.
No, it's nothing,
she said, perhaps a little too quickly.
It's just a long way to go, and the assemblage... I don't know, they've always kind of scared me.
Tika nodded along. She wasn't surprised.
I hear ya. Some of the magi there can get kind of stuffy and full of themselves,
she acknowledged before shrugging helplessly.
If you don't want to come, it's okay. I don't want to pressure you or anything.
The two were quiet for a few seconds. Aveline closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She toyed with her bracelet for a few seconds more, then lowered her hand and opened her eyes. She turned to Tika.
I'll see what I can do,
she said finally. Tika perked up, eyes wide with hope.
Really?
Aveline smiled at the enthusiasm.
Yes, really. I can't promise that I'll make it, but I would like the chance to spend some more time with you.
Her smile became more playful.
Strange. In a good way.
Tika snickered.
I try,
she said, thumping a fist to her chest.
Hey, it'd give me the perfect chance to show you around my neighborhood. So it would.
Aveline agreed with a nod. She opened her mouth to say something more, but thought better of it. She folded her hands behind her back and nodded.
I guess with any luck, I'll see you then. Take care, Tika.
Tika grinned.
Will do. See you, Aveline.
With that, Aveline turned and made her way up to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob to give Tika one more look. She smiled warmly, offered a friendly parting wave, and then disappeared inside. Tika waved back at her as she went, calling out a farewell. The clunk of the door shutting reverberated in her head for a few harsh seconds as she lingered in the street. She was already feeling impatient for their next meeting. After a few more seconds, though, she turned and began the long walk back to the upper city, an obvious spring to her step. And as she went, she sang to herself in her people's language, filling the streets with the sound of birdsong.